someone actually went about drinking wine with ashes of hearts and said, Sauvignon Blanc? No. Cabernet Sauvignon? No. Port. That's the best one. Hello there, and welcome to Ghost Stories and Art. This is the show where we talk about a ghost story and read some bits of it for the month of October. I'll also be making some art inspired by the piece, so I hope you stick around for that. But without further ado, let me introduce you to the story we'll be reading today. It is Lost Hearts from M.R.James's collected ghost stories. And disclaimer, this story does have mentions of gore, implications of moide, and description of crime scenes, so viewer discretion is quite advised. And it means the world to me if you hit that subscribe button, left a like on this video, and maybe even left a comment. Join Ghost Gang today by doing all that nice stuff. Let's get into the story. So in the year 1811, in the month of September, a little boy comes to visit his cousin. The house is tall, red bricked with beautiful white windows, and it's got a little park around it. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in early autumn, which was conveyed to the mind of the boy who was standing in the porch waiting for the door to open to him. So this poor boy has been left an orphan, and his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, had come to his aid and offered for him to come live with him. Pretty nice of him, and quite surprising, as said here. The offer was unexpected because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new and, it seemed, incongruous element. And we go into a little description of Mr. Abney. No one really knew him, however, he is described as a very knowledgeable, educated person, the professor of Greek at Cambridge, and with a library that contained all the then available books bearing on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neoplatonists. I would like some of that. He was looked upon in fine as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that he should even have heard of his orphan cousin Stephen Elliot, much more than he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. Keep that in mind. So Mr. Abney, tall, thin, austere, was very kind in his receiving of Stephen, asking the boy, How are you? How old are you? That is, you're not too much tired, I hope, I journey to eat your supper. So he comes across as very caring, very nice, and he keeps asking the boy, how old is he? And how old are you, my boy? It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir, said Stephen. And when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September, eh? Well, that's very well. Nearly a year hence, isn't it? And I like to get these things down in my book. Sure it's 12? Certain? Peculiar. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had yet met in Aswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. That's nice. So she is essentially the main housekeeper of Aswarby Hall, and her residence was of 20 years standing, so she knew everything about the house, everyone that went in, went out, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. We love a gossip girl. So now it's been a couple of months since Stephen first moved in, and in November he was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room and asked her, Is Mr. Abney a good man? And will he go to heaven? As children, we're very curious about the most random of things, so it's quite normal that he asked that. Good. "Bless the child," said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as I ever see. Didn't I never tell you of the little boy as he took in out of the street, as you may say, the 7 years back, and a little girl 2 years after I first come here? No, do tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch, now this minute." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "the little girl I don't seem to recollect so much about. I know Master brought her back with him from his walk one day and gave orders to Miss Ellis, as was housekeeper then, as she should be took every care with. And the poor child had no one belonging to her. She told me so her own self. And here she lived with us a matter of 3 weeks it might be, and then whether she was something of a gypsy in her blood or what not, but one morning she out of her bed afore any of us had opened an eye, and neither track nor yet trace of her have I set eyes on since. Master was wonderful put about, and had all the ponds tracked, but it's my belief she was had away by the gypsies, and they was singing around the house for as much as an hour the night she went, and Parks he declare, as he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, dear, poor child she was, so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderful taken up with her, so domesticated she was. Surprising. So, the girl that he took in, to say the least, she lived there for a little while, and then she disappeared, essentially, and they thought, because she had gypsy blood in her, her kin came back to get her and took her back with them. Allegedly. "And what about the little boy?" asked Stephen. "Ah, the poor boy," sighed Miss Bunch. "He were a foreigner, Giovanni he called himself, and he came a-tweaking his urdy-gurdy round and about the tribe one winter day, and Master had him in that minute, and asked all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and where was his relatives, and all as kind as his heart could wish. But it went the same way with him. They're unruly rot, them foreign nations. I do suppose as he was off one morning, just the same as the girl. Why he went and what he'd done was a question for as much as a year after, for he never took his urdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf. 2 kids come to the hall, and both disappear. So after Mrs. Bunch tells him the stories of the 2 children, he goes to bed, and he has a curious dream. At the end of the passage, at the top of the house in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, he could look in and see the lead-lined bath affixed to the wall on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I am speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Mission's Church in Dublin, which possessed the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure, inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden colour, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, the thin lips crooked in a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from his lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage in the full light of the moon. With the courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. So more time passes, and now it's springtime. And I feel like this is quite important to read out rather than retell, as it gives some hints as to what is going on. Listen carefully. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had been always considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself and to shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remarks on the subject. 2 incidents that occurred about this time made an impression upon Stephen's mind. The first was after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that he had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he had had. The following evening, Mrs. Bunch was occupying himself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably, "how do you manage to tea your nightdress all to flinders this way? Look here, sir, what trouble do you give to poor servants that have to darn and mend after you? Boys, am I right?" There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits or scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skillful needle to make good. They were confined to the left side of the chest, long parallel slits about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piercing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure they were not there the night before. "But," he said, "Mrs. Bunch, they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, and I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how the marks and scratches can come there. Too high up for any cat or dog to have made them, much less a rat." She essentially advises Stephen not to tell his cousin about any of it, and to just ignore it, and lock the doors before he goes to bed. And to that he replies, "I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've said my prayers." What a good child. And the next day, they have an interesting discussion with the butler, Mr. Parks, who is said to like to keep to himself. However, he was very flustered this morning. "Master may get up his own wine if he likes of an evening," was his first remark. "Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very likely it's the rats or the wind gone into the cells, but I'm not so young as I was, and I can't go through with it as I have done." "Well, Mr. Parks, you know, it's a surprising place for the rats in the hole." "I'm not denying that, Mrs. Bunch, and to be sure many a time I've heard the tale from the men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid no confidence in that before, but tonight, if I'd demeaned myself to lay my ear to the door of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they were saying." So we've got weird dreams, we've got weird scratches, and now we've got discussions that should not be had in the middle of the night by anyone. You tell me what this all alludes to. So after Mr. Parks discusses his findings in the cellar, Mrs. Bunch just makes fun of him. But he tries to say that it's not in his will to be joking about such matters, especially in front of Stephen, who knows what his jokes are like. So this day, March 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people were sweeping past him on the wind, borne on restlessly and aimlessly, vainly striving to stop themselves, to catch at something that might arrest their flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world, of which they had formerly a part. After lunch that day, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight as late as 11 o'clock to my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to know you something connected with your future life, which it is most important that you should know. You are not to mention this matter to Mrs. Bunch nor to anyone else in the house, and you had better go to your room at the usual time." So, knowing what we know about the kids, about the weird experiences, and the significance of springtime, I would run out of the house. But Stephen found this all very exciting. He eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. Now we arrive at 10 o'clock in the evening. Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom looking out over the country. Still as the night was, the mysterious population of the distant moonlit woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time strange cries as of lost and despairing wanderers sounding from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or water birds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. Were not they coming nearer? Now they sounded from the nearest side of the water, and in a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased, but just as Stephen was thinking of shutting the window and resuming his readings of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the gravel terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall, the figures of a boy and girl. As it seemed, they stood side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired him with more acute fear. Whilst the girl stood still, half smiling with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape, with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace and of unpleasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long, and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment, this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle and go down to Mr. Abney's study for the hour appointed, for the meeting was near at hand. The study or library opened out of the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. To effect an entrance was not so easy. The door was not locked, he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of it as usual. His repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What? Why did he try to cry out? And why was the cry choked in his throat? Had he, too, seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held out by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experiences as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes, which to us modern have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experience as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes, which to us moderns have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained. That, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of a boy, whom, to use the libellist phrase employed by the author of Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, that similar happy results. We are not baking a cake here, okay? We are talking about human lives. Similar happy results is such an interesting way of putting whatever is happening here. It's amazing. Let's continue. Similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 12 years. To the testing of the truth of this receipt, I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiments such persons as could conveniently be removed without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of gypsy extraction, on March 24th, 1792. The second by the removal of a wandering Italian lad named Giovanni Paoli in the night of March 23rd, 1805. The final victim, to employ a word repugnant in the highest degree of my feelings, must be my cousin Stephen Elliott. His day must be this, March 24th, 1812. Now we know. But do I feel better about knowing? Probably not. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes and to mingle them with about a pin some red wine, preferably port. Preferably port. Someone actually went about drinking wine with ashes of hearts and said, Sauvignon Blanc? No. Cabernet Sauvignon? No. Port. That's the best one. A disused bathroom or wine cellar will be found convenient for such a purpose. Rats, eh? Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portion of the subject which popular language dignifies with the name of ghosts. But the man of philosophic temperament, to whom alone the experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attach importance to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. I contemplate with the liveliest satisfaction the enlarged and emancipated existence which the experiment, if successful, will confer on me, not only placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so-called, but eliminating to a great extent the prospect of death itself. I think as humans we've always wanted things that are not as easily reachable, such as flight, control of the elements, living forever. But the means of getting there, is it worth it? I don't think it is, quite personally, to take the lives of innocents who've yet to even experience life. Just so you could live forever and do what? Read your books all day, every day for millennia? Really? Despicable. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound exposing the heart. There was no blood on his hands, and a long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. A savage wildcat might have inflicted the injuries. The window of the study was open, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Avenue had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Eliot's study of the papers I have quoted led him to a very different conclusion. I absolutely love this story. There's so much to decipher, so much to discuss about the morality of everything, the purpose, the delusion that we see today as well. You know, we don't have to be in 1800s to see the useless deaths of people for someone else's benefit, so to speak. It's nice to see that at least once justice was served, and it is sad that a second person had to die for it to be fully executed. Alright? Beautifully written, as always. Really, really amazing story. And I would recommend you go and read it yourself, because there are some bits and descriptions that I skipped over for time purposes, and I think getting to the meat of it is a bit more interesting than just reading the general bits. I hope you enjoyed this. If you do, again, I encourage you to subscribe, like this video, leave a comment, and I hope to see you all very, very soon with another story. Take good care, and don't go killing people for hearts.